In the deepest, most silent heart of the North American wilderness, where the snow falls so thick it swallows all sound, the old tribes speak of a whisper on the wind. It's not the whisper of a man or an animal, but something far older and infinitely hungrier. They call it the Wendigo, born from the ultimate transgression in a place of scarcity, cannibalism. But the Wendigo is more than just a cursed man. It's a malevolent spirit, a demon of gluttony and insatiable hunger that possesses the starving, twisting their souls and bodies into something monstrous. It becomes the embodiment of the winter itself, relentless, cruel, and starving. And as the days grow short and the cold begins to bite, they say the line between our world and its world grows thin. The deep forests become its hunting ground once more. It's in this time of fading light that the stories resurface. Whispers of encounters with the gaunt, unstoppable hunger that walks on the wind. Tonight, we open the folklore files to bring you some of the most chilling of those stories. But before we begin our descent into the cold and the dark, if you find yourself drawn to the shadows and the stories that dwell within, make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring that bell. You wouldn't want to miss what's lurking in the next video. If these tales send a shiver down your spine, let us know by leaving a like, and please, share your own stories or thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Now, stoke the fire, lock your doors, and listen closely. The wind is picking up, and it's bringing something with it. For 6 moons, the presence had been with him. It did not start as a shape, but as a feeling, a cold, leaden weight in the pit of his stomach upon waking, the unshakable certainty that his solitude in the family cabin was no longer solitude, but a shared space. Then came the sounds. It began with the whispers. They would slither from the deep woods behind his home, mimicking the voices of his parents, long since passed. They called his name with a tenderness that was a grotesque mockery, a siren song meant to lure him into the dark, leafless embrace of the winter forest. He never answered. He would simply stand at the window, his knuckles white on the frame, and watch the tree line. Then came the knocking. A repulsive, dry cracking sound, like old bones being beaten against the trunks of the ancient pines. It wasn't a random noise. It was a taunt, a countdown to some unspeakable culmination. And finally, the figure appeared. A skeletal, unnaturally tall shape, pale as old bone against the dark bark of the trees. It stood at the absolute edge of where the tree line met his property, motionless, its eyes burning with the cold, phosphorescent glow of dying coals. It was always watching. Caleb knew what it was. The long limbs, the antlers that seemed to sprout from a distorted skull, the unbearable thinness that spoke of an endless, raging hunger. He had spent the first month in a state of primal fear, the kind that liquefies your bones and fills your mind with static. He'd barricaded the doors, slept with a rifle in his arms, and jumped at every creak of the old cabin. But the fear didn't kill him. It festered. It matured. And somewhere around the 4th moon, a profound shift occurred. The fear, having failed to paralyze him, ignited. It became a cold, focused fuel. He understood then that flight was not an option. This thing, this Wendigo, was not an animal that would lose interest. It was a spiritual cancer, a manifestation of consumption that would feed on his despair, his flight, his very life force until there was nothing left. It would hound him to the ends of the earth, and the torment in his dreams would become the permanent reality of his existence. He would not run. If it wanted his life, it would have to come and take it from his cold, dead hands, on his land. His cabin, a hermitage he'd once loved for its peace, was transformed. It was no longer a refuge. It was an arsenal, a sanctum, a war room. Books on local folklore lay open next to boxes of ammunition. On the sturdy oak table that had seen generations of family meals, rested his only true hope, a large hunting knife. This was no ordinary blade. A grizzled old man from a nearby reservation, one of the few who still remembered the old ways, had provided it. He had looked at Caleb with eyes that held centuries of sorrow and said, "The iron and the gun, they will only make it angry. You cannot kill a spirit with a bullet. You must wound it with something that carries the essence of the life it despises. You must get close. So close you can smell its breath of rot and ice." The blade had been tempered not in water, but in a mixture of bear fat and sacred herbs. The handle, freshly wrapped by Caleb, was bound with cloth soaked in sage oil. The old man had been clear. Fire purifies, and while setting the creature ablaze was the stuff of hopeful legends, the symbol of that purification, held in the hand of a resolute man, could be a shield. His preparations were not merely physical. Each night, Caleb sat before the fire, the dancing flames reflecting in his steely eyes, and he repeated the names of his family. His mother, his father, his grandfather who had built this cabin. He anchored himself to his humanity, to the love and the memories that were his. It was a mental fortification against the psychic onslaught of the Wendigo, against the whispers of despair and the promises of power it would use to break his will. He knew it would try to seduce him, to offer him the return of his loved ones, or dominion over his fears, if only he would lay down his weapon and surrender. He had to empty his heart of all want, for any desire would be a hook in his soul for the creature to pull on. His plan was not one of brute force, but of grim strategy and sacrifice. He had chosen the clearing 100 yards into the woods, a place where the moon shone bright and unobstructed. There, on the frozen ground, he had drawn concentric circles with a mixture of ash and salt. They were not meant to trap the creature, such a hope was folly, but to disrupt it. The legends spoke of their speed, a blur of unnatural movement. The circles were a labyrinth, a conceptual cage meant to confuse, to slow, to force the fight into a contained, intimate space. A space where one well-placed thrust could end it. He looked out the window. It was there, as he knew it would be. A pale stain in the twilight, those cold, glowing eyes fixed on his cabin. It was waiting for his resolve to crack, for the fear to return. It would wait in vain. Caleb picked up the knife. The weight of it was comforting, a promise of finality. He pulled on his heavy coat and opened the cabin door. The winter air was a slap in the face, so cold it felt solid. He did not look back. The walk to the clearing was the longest of his life. Every shadow seemed to writhe. The knocking started again, louder, more frantic, a percussive frenzy from all around him. The whispers came now not as imitation, but as promises and threats, slithering directly into his mind. Caleb, so alone. We can fill the silence. We can bring them back. Your strength is a flicker. Our hunger is eternal. Join the feast. He clenched the knife, feeling the rough, sage-soaked cloth against his palm. He focused on the memory of his father's laugh, the smell of his mother's bread. He built a wall of those memories and pushed the voices back. He stepped into the clearing. The moonlight bathed the scene in an eerie, blue-silver luminescence. His ashen salt circles glowed faintly. He stood in the center, his breath pluming in the frigid air, and waited. The forest fell silent. The knocking ceased. The whispers vanished. It was a vacuum of sound, more terrifying than any noise. Then, from the opposite tree line, it emerged. It was taller than he remembered, a blasphemy of form. Its limbs were elongated and twitched with a spider-like grace. The pale, taut skin seemed to barely contain the jagged bones beneath. Its head, crowned with a grotesque rack of antlers, swiveled slowly, and those coal-fire eyes locked onto him. It didn't run. It stalked forward, its movements fluid and unervingly silent, its long, claw-tipped fingers twitching at its sides. A low, guttural rasp, like stones grinding together in a frozen gullet, emanated from it. The smell hit him first, the scent of old graves, of spoiled meat, and beneath it, the cold, sterile odor of deep winter. It crossed the first salt circle. A shudder went through the creature, a ripple of distaste. Its speed, for a fraction of a second, seemed to falter. It was working. Caleb stood his ground, his knees bent, the knife held firmly in front of him. The creature's eyes burned brighter, and a wave of pure psychic malice washed over him. Visions flashed in his mind, images of his own body, torn and devoured, of the cabin burning, of the faces of his parents, twisted in agony. It was trying to flood him with terror, to make him drop his weapon and run. But Caleb had already passed through that fear. He had metabolized it. He let the visions wash over him and through him, acknowledging them but not accepting them. He was an island in a storm of horror. The Wendigo let out a shriek of pure frustration, a sound that tore at the fabric of the night. It lunged, crossing the remaining circles in a blur. The salt and ash flared for an instant, and the creature's charge lost its supernatural precision. It was still fast, terrifyingly so, but now it was a speed Caleb's eyes could track. He sidestepped its first swipe, the claws whistling past his face, close enough for him to feel the deathly cold they radiated. He swung the knife, not to strike, but to ward it off. The blade passed near the creature's arm, and it recoiled with a hiss, not of pain, but of revulsion. The sacred herbs, the essence of life, were an anathema to it. They began to circle each other within the confines of the innermost circle, a macabre dance under the moonlight. The Wendigo was a predator of fear and flight, not of a stand-up fight against a prepared and resolute foe. It feinted and lunged again. This time, Caleb wasn't fast enough. A set of claws raked across his shoulder, tearing through his coat and into the flesh beneath. The pain was immediate and searing, a cold fire that felt like frostbite and acid combined. He gritted his teeth, swallowing a cry. The taste of his own blood seemed to enrage the creature further, its hunger becoming a palpable force. It pressed its attack, its movements becoming more frenzied, less calculated. It was giving in to its nature. Caleb saw his opening. As the creature lunged for a final, decisive strike, its massive form eclipsing the moon, he didn't try to dodge. Instead, he dropped low and surged forward, inside its guard. He met the creature's charge with his own. The impact was like hitting a tree made of ice and bone. He drove the knife upward, putting all his weight, all his fury, all his 6 months of torment, into the thrust. The blade, tempered in bear fat and sanctified by sage, sank deep into the creature's chest. A sound erupted from the Wendigo that was not of this world, a high, piercing shriek that seemed to crack the very air. It wasn't just a cry of pain, it was the sound of a fundamental blasphemy. The cold fire in its eyes flared violently, then began to dim. It thrashed, its claws tearing at his back, but the strength was already leaving its limbs. Caleb held on, driving the knife deeper, twisting it. He looked into the dying eyes of the entity, his own face a mask of grim determination and pain. "I am not your prey," he whispered, his voice hoarse but steady. "I am the consequence." The creature's form began to contort and collapse in on itself. The pale skin cracked like old porcelain, revealing not blood or bone, but a swirling, black emptiness within. A final, cold wind burst from its body, carrying the scent of decay and a fading whisper. Then, with a sound like a sigh of absolute desolation, it dissolved into a pile of fine, gray ash and a scattering of ancient, brittle bones. The silence that returned to the forest was different. It was no longer a predatory silence, but the true, deep quiet of a winter night. Caleb stood, panting, his body screaming in agony. The wounds on his shoulder and back bled freely, but the cold fire was gone, replaced by a throbbing, human pain. He looked down at the ashes, already beginning to be scattered by the wind. It was over. He turned and walked back towards the cabin, his steps slow and heavy. He was just a man again, wounded and tired, standing in the snow. But as he looked at the warm light glowing from his window, he knew a fundamental truth. To kill an eternal hunger, you cannot simply fight it. You must become something else. You must become the end of its story. He had not slain the beast with strength, but with will. And in the heart of the winter, a different kind of cold had finally won. There is a silence that is louder than any scream. It's the silence that has followed Brian for 7 years. It lives in the empty spaces of his small, anonymous apartment, far from the snow-laden pines of his childhood in Canada. It's in the way people's eyes slide away from his, a reflex born from a story they think they know. They called him a killer. But the truth he carries is far heavier, and infinitely more terrifying. It happened when he was 14, an age where immortality is taken for granted and fear is a game. The three musketeers, they called themselves. Brian, the cautious heart, Liam, the brash, fearless leader with a mischievous grin, and Chloe, whose sharp intellect was often the voice of reason. Their playground was the vast, untamed wilderness that bordered their small town, a place already steeped in whispers. The adults spoke in low tones of a presence in the deep woods, a Wendigo, a story to keep children from wandering too far. To them it was just that, a story. It was Liam's idea, of course. To prove their courage, to debunk the myth once and for all, they would venture into the heart of the forbidden stretch of forest, the one the old-timers pointedly avoided. Liam, ever the showman, would be the one to document their triumph. He brought his father's old camcorder, its weight a promise of the adventure to come. They set off on a crisp afternoon, the winter sun a pale, lemon-yellow coin in a steel-gray sky. The air was sharp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and frozen earth. Laughter came easily, their voices loud and defiant against the immense quiet of the woods. They crossed creeks iced over at the edges, their boots cracking the thin layer of frost on fallen logs. They went further than they had ever dared, marking their path with red ribbons as the sun began its swift winter descent. By the time Chloe voiced the concern they all felt, it was too late. "We should head back," she said, her breath pluming in the rapidly cooling air. The sun was bleeding out behind the mountains, casting long, skeletal shadows from the trees. Liam, grinning, waved the camcorder. "And miss the best part? The legend says it comes out at night. We'll camp. We've got the tent. We'll prove nothing's here and be heroes by breakfast." The argument was weak, but the allure of the adventure was strong. They found a small, relatively flat clearing and set up the tent as the last light bled from the world, plunging them into a deep, moonless dark. The forest, once a place of playful mystery, became a cavern of unknown sounds. The friendly rustles of the day were replaced by the groaning of trees and the occasional, unnerving crack of a branch in the distance. They huddled inside the tent, the thin nylon fabric feeling impossibly flimsy. They tried to laugh, to tell stories, but their voices were strained. That's when the first sound came. Not a rustle, but a heavy, deliberate crunch. Something was stepping on the frozen snow, circling them. "Probably a moose," Liam whispered, but his bravado was cracking. He fumbled for the camcorder, his hands shaking. The footsteps stopped. Then came a low, guttural inhale, a sound that was wet and ragged, like air being dragged through a punctured lung. It was close. Too close. Chloe gripped Brian's arm, her nails digging into his jacket. Then, a silhouette passed between their tent and the distant, star-dusted sky. It was tall, impossibly so, its form a gaunt, twisted parody of a human shape. It moved with an unnerving, loping grace, and for a terrifying second, its head, crowned with a jagged, unnatural silhouette, turned towards their tent. 2 points of light, like chips of frozen star, glowed where its eyes should have been. It wasn't a moose. It wasn't a bear. The stories were true. A primal, ice-cold fear seized Brian, a fear so absolute it felt like his very soul was freezing solid. Chloe stifled a sob. Liam, however, was galvanized by a different, more dangerous impulse. The need for proof, to capture the impossible. "It's real," he breathed, his voice a mixture of terror and exhilaration. He raised the camcorder, the little red recording light piercing the dark of the tent like a drop of blood. "Liam, no," Brian hissed, but it was too late. Liam unzipped the tent flap. The creature, which had been moving away, stopped dead. It turned slowly, its full, horrifying height now visible. The pale, almost luminous skin stretched taut over a frame of jutting bones and sinew. The glow of its eyes intensified, fixing on Liam. A wave of psychic nausea washed over them, a feeling of bottomless hunger and ancient malice. Liam stood frozen in the doorway, the camcorder held up, its lens capturing the abomination. The creature let out that rasping, grinding sound again. It took a step forward. Then another. It wasn't running. It was stalking. A predator that knew its prey was cornered. "Get back inside," Chloe screamed. But Liam was paralyzed, either by fear or by the sheer, overwhelming reality of the thing in his viewfinder. The Wendigo covered the distance between them in 2 terrifyingly swift, fluid strides. It was not a blur of motion, but a chilling, efficient progression, as if it simply ignored the space between them. A long, skeletal arm shot out. The claws, black and sharp like shards of obsidian, glinted in the starlight. There was no struggle, no dramatic fight. There was a sickening, wet tear, a choked gasp from Liam, and the thud of the camcorder hitting the frozen ground. The red light winked out. The creature did not linger. It grabbed Liam's limp form and, with an effortless, horrifying strength, melted back into the darkness of the trees, its movements silent once more. The entire encounter had lasted less than 10 seconds. The silence that returned was deafening, broken only by Chloe's hyperventilating breaths and Brian's own heart hammering against his ribs. They were alone. The tent flap swung open, revealing the trampled snow and the dark, star-shaped stain where Liam had fallen. The camcorder lay in the snow, a silent witness. They didn't sleep. They didn't speak. They huddled together, waiting for the dawn, every sound from the forest sending fresh jolts of terror through them. When the first gray light finally filtered through the trees, they stumbled out of the tent. The evidence was there, the disturbed snow, the blood, the abandoned camcorder. But no Liam. The search party found them later that day, shivering and in shock. The story they told, a frantic, tearful jumble about a tall, pale creature, was met with skeptical frowns and shaking heads. The police found the camcorder. The tape inside showed only a few seconds of shaky, dark footage. The frantic exit from the tent, a blur of trees, a terrifyingly tall, pale shape, and then the image spinning wildly before cutting to static as it hit the ground. It was proof of nothing, and of everything. The town had its narrative. A tragic camping accident. A fight, perhaps. Two teenagers, their story too wild to be true, covering up the death of their friend. The whispers started, then the outright accusations. What really happened out there, Brian? Did you push him? Your friend is dead because of your stupid stunt. Their families became pariahs. Within a year, both Brian and Chloe's families had moved away, shattered by the loss and the condemnation. But the true horror, the one that has festered in Brian's mind for 7 long years, was not the creature itself, nor the town's rejection. It was a detail from the old legends he'd researched obsessively since that night, a desperate attempt to understand. The Wendigo is not just a predator. It is a curse. It possesses. It transforms. It consumes the soul and then wears the body, twisting it into a new vessel for its endless hunger. Liam's body was never found. The official report listed him as presumed deceased. But Brian knows better. In the deepest, most silent hours of the night, when the wind howls just right, he is haunted by a new, more terrible possibility. The creature didn't just kill his friend that night. It recruited him. It initiated him into its eternal, starving existence. He sees Liam sometimes in his dreams, not the laughing boy with a camcorder, but a gaunt, pale figure standing at the edge of a frozen forest, his eyes glowing with a cold, familiar fire. The friend they went to find was lost. But Brian fears, with a certainty that chills him to the bone, that something wearing Liam's face was found. Or rather, something that Liam became. He wasn't just unfound by the search parties. He was unfound by death itself, trapped in a different, more terrible kind of finding. And on the long, cold winter nights, Brian doesn't wonder if the Wendigo is still out there. He wonders which one. There is a unique kind of arrogance that comes from city living. It's not a loud arrogance, but a quiet one, born from the belief that the wild is a curated experience. A national park you visit, a scenic view you photograph, a soundtrack of birdsong you can turn off. Ilara had carried this arrogance with her when she fulfilled her dream of moving to a small, rustic house nestled at the edge of a vast, ancient forest. For her, the woods were the ultimate antidote to a life spent in glass and steel cubicles. It was freedom. Her companions in this new life were Thor and Loki, 2 large German shepherds with souls of gold and the protective instincts of ancient guardians. Their evening runs were the sacred ritual that marked the end of her remote workday. As her screen went dark, she would leash them up, and they would burst out into the twilight, their powerful bodies pulling her down the trail that skirted the tree line. The scent of pine and damp earth was her therapy. The first true chill of the approaching winter was in the air when her neighbor, Agnes, flagged her down. Agnes was a woman in her 60s, her face a road map of a life lived close to the land. Her eyes, the color of weathered bark, held a weight Alara didn't yet understand. "Heading out for your run?" Agnes asked, her gaze drifting past Alara to the darkening tree line. "Yes, just a quick one before it gets completely dark," Alara replied, giving the leashes a gentle tug as Thor whined in anticipation. Agnes's eyes snapped back to her. With the cold coming in, the true cold, it's better to do your running when the sun is high. Or stick to the main road where there are people. Alara smiled, the polite, dismissive smile of someone humoring an eccentric. "I appreciate the concern, Agnes, really. But I've made sure to learn the trails. I don't go deep into the forest at night. Just stick to the path near the house. It's perfectly safe." A shadow passed over Agnes's face. "The forest isn't dangerous because of the terrain, dear. It's dangerous because of what lives in it. Many of us have seen it. When the snow starts to fall, it gets hungry. It's better to avoid the danger altogether." Alara's smile tightened. She'd heard the whispers, of course. The locals spoke in hushed tones about a spirit of the winter, a Wendigo. To her, it was just folklore, a charming, if slightly macabre, piece of local color. "I'll be careful," she said, a non-answer that served as a dismissal. "Don't worry about me." She gave a final wave and set off, the dogs surging forward, leaving Agnes standing alone on her porch, a silent, worried sentinel. For a couple of weeks, the routine held. The air grew sharper, the nights longer, but Alara and her dogs ran on, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The forest, however, began to change. The friendly, familiar rustles seemed to fall silent as she passed. The birdsong that usually accompanied the sunset ceased earlier. An odd, watchful stillness settled in the woods. The night it happened, the weather forecast predicted the first major snowfall, one that would lock the landscape in white for months. It was Alara's last chance for a proper run, a final farewell to the trails before the long winter hibernation. A determined energy filled her. She would do the long loop, the one that ventured a little further from the safety of her porch light. They set off at a good pace. But about a mile in, where the path curved and the trees grew dense and dark, the dogs faltered. Thor, usually leading the charge, planted his feet and let out a low, guttural growl, his head cocked towards the impenetrable wall of pines. Loki echoed the sentiment, his body tense, a high-pitched whine escaping his throat. "Come on, boys," Alara urged, tugging on the leashes. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. They refused to move forward. Instead, they strained backward, toward home, their whines turning into frantic, fearful barks. The hair on their backs stood straight up. A cold knot, entirely separate from the winter air, tightened in Alara's stomach. She had never seen them like this. They were terrified. Prudence, a long-dormant instinct, finally overrode her arrogance. "Okay," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Okay, we're going back." She turned around, and the dogs immediately fell silent, pulling her homeward with a desperate strength. They had only gone a few hundred yards when she heard it. A sound from deep within the woods, parallel to their path. It wasn't a deer. It was too fast, too heavy. It was the sound of something running on two legs, crashing through the undergrowth with a terrifying, reckless speed. Twigs snapped like gunshots. It was keeping pace with them. Fear, pure and undiluted, injected itself into her veins. "Run!" she yelled to the dogs, but they were already running, dragging her along the path. Ahead, the welcoming lights of her house were visible through the trees. Hope flared. They were going to make it. Then it emerged. From the tree line, not 30 feet away, a figure launched itself onto the path. It was tall, so impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and skeletal. Pale, almost gray skin was stretched taut over a frame that was all sharp angles and jutting bone. Its head was a nightmare, a distorted, almost human shape crowned with a grotesque rack of antlers. And its eyes. They were black pits that seemed to suck the very light from the air around them, burning with a cold, ancient hunger. It stood between them and home. Ilara's scream was ripped from her throat, a raw, involuntary sound of pure terror. She was paralyzed, her mind refusing to process the impossible thing standing before her. But Thor and Loki were not paralyzed. Their fear transformed in an instant into a ferocious, protective rage. With a roar that tore from his massive chest, Thor launched himself at the creature, his powerful jaws aiming for its throat. Loki, a black streak of fury, latched onto its spindly arm. The Wendigo barely seemed to notice Loki. It moved with a blurring, unnatural speed. A long, bony arm swatted Thor away as if he were a stuffed toy. The 100-pound dog was lifted off the ground and flung through the air, his body impacting a tree trunk with a sickening, final crunch. He did not get up. Ilara's scream turned into a continuous, mindless wail. No. No. Loki, still clinging to its arm, was being shaken violently. The creature then began to batter him against the frozen ground. Once, twice, the dull thuds horribly loud in the night. Loki's yelp of pain was a dagger in Ilara's heart. "Leave him alone. Please!" she shrieked, her body still frozen in place, tears freezing on her cheeks. Suddenly, the roar of an engine and the blinding glare of high beams cut through the darkness. A pickup truck skidded to a halt on the path, its doors flying open. The sharp, deafening crack of a rifle shot split the air. Agnes's husband, a man with a face as grim as granite, stood braced against the truck door, rifle to his shoulder. Agnes and their 2 adult sons stood beside him, one with a shotgun, the other with a heavy hunting rifle. The Wendigo's head snapped toward the new threat. It let out a rasping, grinding hiss of pure fury. It dropped Loki's limp form and, in a movement that defied physics, seemed to dissolve back into the shadows of the forest, vanishing as if it had never been there. The silence that followed was broken only by the truck's rumbling engine and Ilara's ragged, hysterical sobs. No one spoke. Agnes hurried over, her face set in a grim mask of sorrow, not surprise. Her sons gently lifted Loki's broken body into the truck bed. Thor was already gone. They helped the trembling, nearly catatonic Ilara into the cab, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. They drove her home in silence. There were no "I told you so's," no recriminations. The horror of the event was language enough. Thor was buried the next day under the old oak in her backyard. Loki survived, but with 3 broken ribs and a fractured leg, his spirit as wounded as his body. Ilara's arrogance was gone, burned away in the cold fire of that encounter. She had learned the hardest lesson the wilderness can teach, that it does not care for your dreams or your disbelief. It has its own rules, its own inhabitants, its own ancient dangers. The warnings of those who know the land are not born from superstition, but from a hard-won survival instinct. She had looked into the black, hungry eyes of a folktale and learned a terrifying truth. Some legends are not stories. They are warnings. And you ignore them at your peril. For Mark and Sarah, the winter trip to the remote A-frame cabin had been a dream. A week disconnected from their high-pressure jobs, surrounded by nothing but silent, snow-blanketed forests and each other. It was perfect. On their last night, they had driven to the nearest small town for a final dinner at a rustic pub, feeling cozy and content, the world outside reduced to a warm, lit bubble. The drive back to the cabin, however, was a different beast. The cozy feeling evaporated as they left the town's few lights behind. Their headlights carved a feeble tunnel through an absolute darkness, the kind only found far from cities. The dirt road was a narrow, winding ribbon of ice and packed snow, hemmed in on both sides by a wall of ancient, brooding pines. The indie folk music now felt out of place, a fragile artifice against the primeval silence of the woods. Sarah shifted in her seat, peering out into the impenetrable blackness between the trees. "It's so much darker tonight," she murmured, her breath fogging the passenger window. "Just a cloud cover," Mark said, his hands tight on the wheel, his knuckles white. He was driving slower than usual, the car's tires slipping slightly on patches of black ice. "We're almost there. 10 minutes, tops." That's when they saw it. At first, it was just a shape in the road ahead, caught in the glare of their high beams. Mark slowed, squinting. "Is that a deer?" But as the distance closed, the shape resolved into something else. something that made the blood in their veins turn to ice water. It was tall, gaunt, and unnaturally pale, like a corpse bleached by the moon. Its back was to them, its form grotesquely elongated and skeletal. It was crouched over a dark, shapeless mass on the road. And it was moving. Its shoulders, sharp and bony, hunched and rippled with a horrific, rhythmic motion. A low, wet, tearing sound reached them, faint but unmistakable through the insulated car doors. "Oh God," Sarah whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Mark's foot instinctively hovered over the brake, but a primal warning screamed in his mind. "Don't stop. Don't get closer." He slammed his foot on the clutch and shoved the gearshift into reverse, his movements jerky with panic. The sound of the engine revving backwards seemed to startle the thing in the road. It stopped its feeding and slowly, deliberately, turned its head over its shoulder. Two eyes, like smoldering embers in a skeletal face, locked onto theirs. Its muzzle, elongated and wrong, was stained a glistening, horrific black. In its clawed hands, it clutched a ragged piece of something that was unmistakably, once, part of a human arm. Time froze. Sarah's mind, reeling, tried to make sense of the impossible. The antlers, the impossible thinness, the predatory stillness. The word surfaced from the deepest, most terrified part of her brain. Wendigo. A high, thin whine escaped her lips. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers numb and clumsy. The screen glowed to life. No service. She shook it, holding it up to the windshield, a futile, desperate gesture. No signal. Mark didn't need to be told. He kept the car reversing, one arm braced on the passenger seat headrest, his eyes glued to the nightmare in his rearview mirror. The creature didn't move. It just watched them, its head tilted with a cold, analytical curiosity, as if memorizing their scent, their shape, the very essence of their fear. Then, as suddenly as they had come upon it, Mark found a wider spot in the road. He wrenched the wheel, spinning the car around in a frantic, skidding three-point turn, spraying dirt and snow. He didn't wait to see if it was following. He slammed the accelerator, and the car shot forward, back the way they had come, the headlights now illuminating their frantic escape. They drove in terrified silence for 5 minutes, the only sounds their ragged breathing and the roar of the engine. Sarah finally broke, a sob tearing from her throat. "What was that, Mark? What was that?" "I don't know," he stammered, his face pale. "I don't know. But we're going to the police. Now." The police station in the small town was a modest, single-story building with a flickering fluorescent light. The officer at the desk, a man in his 50s with a weary face and the name tag Miller, listened to their frantic, overlapping story. They described the tall, pale figure, the antlers, the thing it was eating. They expected skepticism, condescension, maybe even a call for a psych evaluation. Officer Miller just listened, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. He didn't interrupt. When they finished, he let out a long, slow sigh, the sound of a man carrying a burden he could never put down. "You're staying at the Henderson cabin, off the old logging road?" he asked, his voice flat. "Yes," Mark said, stunned by the man's calm. "We'll send a car out there to look for the body," Officer Miller said, picking up a notepad. "We'll need your official statements." Mark stared at him, bewildered. "That's it? You don't think we're crazy?" Officer Miller's eyes, old and tired, met his. "Son, in these woods, when the deep winter sets in, people disappear. Hunters, hikers, sometimes folks just passing through. We find their camps torn apart, their belongings scattered. Sometimes we don't find anything at all." He paused, looking down at his hands. "And a lot of locals, good, sane, sensible people, have reported seeing what you described. 4 generations." A cold deeper than any winter chill settled in Sarah's bones. The horror wasn't just in the encounter. It was in the calm, institutional acceptance of it. The monster in the woods was a known, if unspoken, part of the town's reality. "You're saying this is normal?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. "No," Officer Miller said, his tone final. "It's not normal. It's a fact. You two are lucky. You were in a car. You got away. He stood up, the conversation clearly over. Give your statements to the deputy. And my advice: check out of that cabin tonight. Drive to the city. And when the snow falls thick up here, don't come back. They gave their statements in a daze, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. How could they possibly convey the soul-shattering terror of those eyes, the wet sound of its feast, the absolute malevolence that radiated from it? They took the officer's advice. They didn't go back to the cabin. They drove through the night, the darkness outside their windows now feeling alive and predatory. The cozy memory of their vacation was forever tainted, the beautiful forest now a hiding place for an ancient, starving horror. They had gone seeking peace in the quiet of nature. They had found, instead, a stark and terrifying truth: that there are still places in the world where the old stories are not just stories, but warnings whispered on the winter wind, and where the line between the road home and the hunting ground is terrifyingly thin. And so, the cold takes another story into its embrace. From Caleb's grim resolve, to Brian's haunting guilt, to Alara's hard-learned lesson, and finally, to Mark and Sarah's chilling confirmation that some horrors are all too real. These are the Folklore Files. The stories whispered when the wind howls and the snow fall deep. If these tales of the Wendigo have sent a shiver down your spine, then our journey into the dark has been a success. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next descent into legend. Give this video a like if you want to see more, and most importantly, share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to know, which story haunted you the most? Was it the vengeful hunter, the lost friend, the fatal warning, or the roadside horror? Until next time, remember, when the winter wind calls your name, it's best not to answer.